Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Wide Angle. Today a very special guest with us, the former Foreign Secretary of India, Shivshankar Menon, who is on a sabbatical right now writing his second book. Remember, he's the one who told us how difficult choices were made in Indian foreign policy. And to discuss some more of those foreign policy decisions and choices, thank you very much for being with us on the show. The first thing I want to ask you, since you have focused so much of your research and writing on China as well, the recent concluded visit by 10 ASEAN member states as Republic Day chief guest, it was a real departure from foreign policy tradition of one state, the prominence to one nation. What is your view on this?
Well, I thought it was a very good thing, and I think it shows how important we think ASEAN is for us. And I think just the relationship with ASEAN has grown, but I think both sides would like it to grow even faster. So I think it shows the kind of high-level leadership commitment, which matters, because I think in our part of the world, that does drive politics and relationships. So I think as a demonstration of that, I think it was very important. And the fact that all 10 of the ASEAN leaders made it possible for them to come together on a fixed date, I mean, that really was something, I think.
So, you know, analysts will say there's a little bit of realpolitik as well involved in this. We saw a ratcheting up of tensions in Doklam by the Chinese once again in the run-up to Republic Day. Did the troops ever disengage in August last year? Were they just sitting over there and India chose to be silent about it? Many questions around that. But there were some voices that said one of the reasons this happened was also timed with this ASEAN outreach that India was doing, because if India is looking at ASEAN as a sort of way to counterbalance China in the Southeast Asian region, then it would alarm the Chinese.
I'd be skeptical about this kind of explanation for two reasons. One is, I think India-ASEAN relations are important enough on their own, intrinsic to themselves. They have enough reasons for us to do what we did. Secondly, if the Chinese wanted to convey messages and so on, there are much more direct and easy ways to do so. I'm not even sure, frankly, whether there was a Chinese ratcheting up of Doklam just before the visit and so on. Frankly, that you'll have to talk to my successors about. I mean, they would know much better. I'm retired, I'm not into that. But even if the Chinese did want to convey some message about the visit and so on, I don't think they would do it like this. They have direct ways with us, they have direct ways with ASEAN, we're all talking to each other. I don't think this is, you know, in that sense, I wouldn't try and link all this. I think we have a certain relationship with China which today has issues which it didn't have in the past. It also has potential which it didn't have in the past. I think it's a changed situation. And I think that's something we'd have to address separately. And I'm not sure that this is the way to look at it.
You were just saying that you've always said actually the Sino-Indian relationship is civilizational, it goes back, it has a history to it, and a history that has allowed both sides to overcome very tense situations as well in the past, even perhaps overcome some of
and overcome a war, actually.
The war, exactly, the 62 war. But today, I mean, if you look at what media reports, if you look at the kind of statements that come out, if you look at the way analysts are focusing on China, it's really sort of a singular effort to identify one target of foreign policy, one enemy, if you want to use that term, and everything seems geared to how it will place India vis-a-vis the Chinese. Or is that just an assumption that people outside are making?
I think you're right that there is a simplistic and I think wrong narrative which is gaining hold. I mean, I don't think it's everybody, but certainly in the media, if you're stuck to 140 characters, then you know it becomes very simple. And that narrative is that India-China relations are doomed to sort of failure, antagonism, etc., hostility. But I don't think that reflects the truth. This is not some binary true, false, good, bad, black, white kind of relationship. This is a relationship where throughout we have cooperated and we've competed and we've managed our difficulties, our differences. We've managed them for the last 30 years, we did so successfully. I mean, we have the world's biggest boundary dispute, and yet it's the most peaceful border that you have. Nobody's died on that border since the 70s, since 75. October actually. So, and you have managed to, you know how to deal with these things. Problem today is that I think both you and China have risen very fast.
Okay.
You've expanded your own definitions of your own interests, both of you. And you now rub up against each other in the periphery, which you both share. Your periphery is China's and vice versa. So you've got into a situation where you need to actually find a new framework for that relationship, a new way of dealing with it. And you need to sit together with the Chinese and work it out. I think, third countries, other factors, all that counts, but that's peripheral to the primary bilateral core relationship and the issues that you have between yourselves. And there are many issues. I mean, you can see the symptoms of stress in the last few years. Whether it's the NSG, whether it's, and the Chinese will say in return, Belt and Road, South China Sea, etc. I mean, each side will, but the fact is that you need to work out a new modus vivendi between yourselves.
So what could that be going forward?
But that you can only do, that's a process of give and take. You both have to sit at a table, talk it through, and devise a strategic framework. It took through the 80s to arrive at the framework which we did by 88, by the Rajiv Gandhi visit, which was that we will discuss the boundary and settle it peacefully. In the meantime, we won't change the status quo. We will cooperate where we can and not allow the boundary to prevent the building up of a bilateral relationship. And internationally, we'll see where our interests converge, we'll work together. And we did. And that was a framework enough for that time and lasted 30 years, kept the peace, and allowed you to go about the business of developing India.
But you're making the point about how it has lasted for 30 years and now it needs a rethink.
Everything has changed. You've changed, China's changed, the international situation in which you operate has changed, your definition of your interests has changed. I mean, take South China Sea, for instance. When we started reform in 91, about less than 18% of your GDP was foreign trade. And most of it went west to Suez.
Right.
Now, by 2014, 49.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. That's almost half your GDP. And most of it went east through the South China Sea. So for you, in this period, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea has become a core interest.
Right.
In the same period, China notifies the UN in 96 of this 9-dash line, which claims the whole sea. Then starts asserting itself, defines it after 2010 as a core interest. And so now you are both in a situation where you are actually rubbing up against each other, which you didn't have before. And the old framework doesn't give you a way to deal with it.
So linking this very issue to the ASEAN visit, for example, ASEAN countries, Vietnam, Philippines, who have been impacted by Chinese expansion in the waters around their countries, are also sort of looking at India and saying, are you going to take a stand on this or are you not?
Well,
and if it
let's
does
be clear,
impact
on South China Sea, ASEAN has not taken a public stand for the last 5 years.
Right.
And I don't think they have a common ASEAN stand to project right now. So it would be very strange if they came to you and said, you speak, but we won't speak. That doesn't make sense. And this is why I say, we have enough bilateral business with ASEAN of our own. We have a common interest in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. That's true. But that doesn't mean that we don't have other business also. And that's not what's driving India-ASEAN relations. We have trading relations, we have an old cultural, historical, whatever relationship, we have defense relations, we have security cooperation, we have political relationships which are getting more and more important. So this is natural, I think, that we will work together.
So on the South China Sea, for example, on the issue of freedom of navigation, how would India be able to address this with China, given...
Very simple. Sit at a table and talk about maritime security. China says quite clearly that we're not affecting freedom of navigation. China's case is about what she owns.
Right.
Rather than about... And she says she doesn't intend to affect. She said it at the highest level. So then talk about it. And see how we can ensure it and satisfy everybody who needs it. Because these are the world's largest trading nations. China, the US, ASEAN, India. We are the ones who use this. We all have a common interest in freedom of navigation. Surely we can build on that. But we need to put in place guarantees for it.
So in the last a year, maybe a little less than a year, the foreign policy narrative out of Delhi has also changed. I mean, Ram Madhav, who represents the foreign policy voice of the ruling party, in many ways says India has to move away from westward thinking, look eastward. So you have the Indo-Pacific push, you have all of it sort of geared towards sending a message to the Chinese in a sense that we're here to take you on in no uncertain way. Is that the right message? Is that something that India can actually do when it comes to push?
I don't know if that's the message that we are actually projecting. Was Narasimha saying that when he said look east in 1992 in Tokyo? I don't think so. No, I think, I think you're adding a lot of things to saying look east. Of course, the east is much more important to us today than it was before. In the current
context.
But I mean, I don't see why that is necessarily anti-Chinese the way you're saying it is. I mean, that for me it doesn't
But there are concerns about what the Chinese are doing with the Belt and Road,
there are things that China does that bothers you.
Yeah.
CPEC.
Yes.
It's Indian territory.
Yeah.
It affects your sovereignty. You will object and you will do what you can about it. It is your own sovereignty after all.
Right.
But precisely because you have issues like that is why you need to sit and talk these things through and see whether you have ways of dealing with it. I mean, that's why it's important. If you didn't have the issues, you didn't need to worry about all this. But I think the question is really the mix of cooperation and competition in the relationship. You will do both. And that's inevitable, and you've done it for a long time. You will probably do it for many years to come. It's how much of which do you do, and whether you're able to manage the overall relationship. Both sides.
You mentioned the CPEC, and that's something India has been extremely concerned about ever since it was first talked about.
With reason.
And with reason. The Belt and Road Initiative
it's hard to justify it in anything except strategic terms. Most of those projects make no sense in economic terms.
Right.
They will never make enough money to pay it back.
Right, and it's Pakistan's debt trap to worry about, etc. That's their problem. But the question really is, I mean, when we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, and India does feel threatened by the fact that it sees that as expansionism by China,
I don't think, let's be quite clear. If you are so easily threatened, then frankly you're not a great power. If somebody building a road somewhere, building up another port, if you feel so threatened by this, I think you also have to put these things into some kind of context. It questions your sovereignty. It represents a long-term Chinese stake in the present status quo, in Pakistani control of Indian territory. That's what you're objecting to.
Not the rest of the Belt and Road.
That doesn't follow that it's a direct threat to you, your interest. The Chinese have built the Karakoram highway many years ago, inaugurated in 1979.
Right.
They've been sitting on that highway for a long time and using it. And you've objected right through.
Right.
But I think you have to start looking at levels of what you call threat. I mean, I wouldn't say this is a threat today to India, but it certainly questions your sovereignty and creates a Chinese stake.
So what
which is not acceptable to you.
So what is the response?
So that's what you start looking at. That's for the government to decide. And the government knows much more than I do. I've been retired now 4 years.
Yeah. But could India potentially have some kind of a response to the BRI? Could it have a response? And if so, like a logistical
the BRI, I think, is a larger issue.
Yeah.
Apart from CPEC. The rest of BRI doesn't necessarily affect your sovereignty or anything. At least not that I've seen. You also believe that Asian connectivity is good, right?
Right.
We've been talking about it for years, for 20 years actually. Where it makes sense economically, if the projects add to connectivity and can pay for themselves, have internal rates of return that justify them, I think it's a good thing. And frankly, that's something that anybody, if it's open to everybody to use, it's good. I mean, look at Colombo Port, for instance. The last two expansions financed, built by China, 83% of what goes through the port is to or from India.
Right.
Which means somebody else built a port, paid for it, put in the effort, and you get the use of it. As long as it's open, it's economical, and it's purely commercial.
It works for India.
It works.
Okay.
So there are parts of BRI which you shouldn't have an objection to if it's open, and as I said, if it's commercial, and it's purely, and it's evidently so.
Right.
The problem is the bits that don't make economic sense, because then the only justification is strategy,
strategic.
military, some other uses, the dual use kind of, and those are the bits that you will have problems with. So deal with it accordingly.
So you said in connection with China, the best way to deal with any issues that may arise, tensions that may arise, is to come to the table and talk.
I didn't say
right?
all issues. Different issues have different ways of dealing. Where you think there might be some common interest, like on freedom of navigation.
Right.
It's worth sitting down and seeing what the problem is, whether you can devise guarantees which work for everyone. There are other issues where it's unlikely. Like, I mean, you mentioned the road through, Karakoram Highway.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not...
There's no conversation to be had on that.
I mean, you can have a conversation, but you're not sure it'll go anywhere. So you look at other things that there are other issues where Chinese behavior might have changed adversely from your point of view. On Doklam, for instance.
Yes.
For the first time, you saw them making huge public statements and threats even in the media, in the official media. So that's something that you should be telling them, what is this? And then showing them what it means in practice.
There's a greater belligerence in Beijing as well.
Well,
sure. Am I reading that wrong?
As I said, we're both at a very different stage of our behavior and of our definition of our own interests.
Okay.
And certainly, if you look at the Indian media, the Chinese media, of course, there's much more hostility being expressed on both sides. You look at the social media, some of it is pretty abusive.
Yeah.
And that's across the board. So I'm not going into, but I think the important thing is for the states and the governments not to allow this to become there. And if you actually look at what the government of India and what the government of China are saying, they're very careful.
Yeah.
They've been careful to stay away from most of this.
So that tensions don't spike further.
Because I think they realize their responsibility. And that, frankly, what is there to be gained out of building up hostility and so on?
So, moving away a little bit from China, while we're looking at the CPEC and we're looking at that as a strategic threat to India in no uncertain terms, the response when there is an issue with China vis-a-vis the response, at least in the last few years, with issues on Pakistan have been extremely different. Pakistan, there's virtually no interaction, there's no diplomacy, there's nothing now.
But we've had periods like that in the past. I'm not sure that the response has been very different. If you look at the substance of the response, I'm not talking about the packaging and the way it's presented and what.
But in terms of substance and what.
But if you look at the substance of what we've been doing across the world, Pakistan's one instance, but also across the world, I'm not sure that it's so different from what we did before. What has changed is the way we present it, especially domestically.
Yeah.
And the willingness to use foreign policy issues for domestic political gain. I think that is different. That is much higher today than it ever has been probably in the past.
Okay, can you just elaborate?
But if you look at the range of things that,
Yeah.
I mean, with Pakistan, you've had extended periods when you didn't talk to each other, and you had no communication. And not just after the 71 war, but even in this century, in the beginning of this century, you had almost 18 months without a high commissioner.
So it's a cycle that repeats itself, basically.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's become a dance. And it's not a very productive one.
But you made a point that what makes it different
But I think the
this time-
difference is the domestic political play that government seems to try and use it for.
So what one has seen
You
is...
look at the so-called surgical strike, for instance.
Yeah.
In kinetic terms, it's not something that India hasn't done before or since. But I think the willingness to announce it and to use it at home, and maybe an accident, but the timing of it before a state election, I think then immediately people start seeing politics in it.
Well,
but that I think is not necessarily a good thing.
Well, that brings me to my next point, because you mentioned the surgical strikes which took place in Kashmir. The whole narrative on Pakistan, the narrative as far as it comes to Kashmir, the need to create some kind of space for dialogue. No one seems to be having these conversations really. I mean, you've appointed an interlocutor on Jammu and Kashmir. But as you made the point that foreign policy is now not impacting, it's being used for domestic purposes. It's all feeding into a narrative, for want of a better way to put it, that is anti-Muslim, anti the Indian Muslim. How does a diplomat go out into the world and
you'll have to ask
sell Indian diplomacy and democracy when this is what's happening?
You will have to ask a serving diplomat, because I'm not. So I don't have to be diplomatic about these things. No, I think your basic point is right. I'm not sure about this in particular, but I think your basic point is that, you know, you cannot go abroad if you don't have credibility. I mean, if you're talking abroad about pluralism and diversity, but you're acting at home against them, then it's very difficult for you to be credible abroad. And that's the only thing a diplomat really has, is his credibility. He's not carrying a weapon. I mean, it might be implicit, but it's not there on the table. He does not, the person he's dealing with is not subject to the same laws, the same constitution. He's not subject to the same legal jurisdiction that the diplomat can then use and threaten him with. So it's very different from dealing at home with somebody. So what do you have? The diplomat's left with his credibility. And if his actions at home differ from what he's preaching abroad, then I'm afraid that hurts your ability to function, your efficiency.
Do you think in this circumstance, there was a piece recently, I'm sure you read it, which was critical of Indian diplomats for saying, and the piece actually argued that essentially diplomats need to also factor in what's going on and be more critical of the domestic sphere that they're operating in, precisely
I think it
because
said Indian strategic community. It didn't say diplomats. No, I know the piece you're talking about. I actually think the piece is wrong.
Okay.
Because I would argue that if you look at what India is actually doing abroad, it's much the same of what it's done. It's continuous. It's improved, it's bigger, it's more of the same, but it's still basically the same thrust of policy as in the past.
For every region in the world?
For most regions of the world. There might be renewed emphasis on the ties with Israel, for instance.
Yes.
But if you look at, say, the US relationship, that's a relationship which has been growing now for 20, 25 years, and steadily, and gaining, you know, both weight and thickness. But basic thrust of policy is much the same. And now, in that case, an analyst of foreign policy, of strategic policy, it's not his job to sit around saying, oh, but you know, we don't have the domestic sinews to do this, or this is credible. That's not. His job is to analyze that policy and whether it's working. And I think that part of it, I think this article misses. Because this article demands that everybody take a stand on, now whatever your stand at home on domestic issues, I don't think you should bring that bias or prejudice into your analysis of, and I think frankly foreign policy is one of the areas where we've been consistently successful. I wouldn't say more or less successful, because I don't think actually it's more successful or less successful. But it's about the same as it was before. And for me, this is reassuring. This is India at work abroad. It's not one party or one leader, and certainly that is insufficient to explain what we do.
But the point you made about credibility, over the last few days we saw this huge sort of news story unfold where the Prime Minister was reaching out at Davos to investors, potentially selling them the India story, make in India, come invest, etc. We've had an economy which is in a bit of trouble right now, in spite of what GDP figures are saying. People don't have jobs, there's no money coming in. We also had all that happen as a mob protesting a movie went riot on a school bus right outside the national capital. Doesn't it make the job of a diplomat harder when you've got the Prime Minister on the world stage selling this and the news coming out is all this?
If your job is to go and get investment, they're not going to invest in you because you're plural and diverse, or because they think your domestic policies are wonderful and inclusive.
Okay.
People invest because they make money.
Right.
And people are investing, and you can see foreign investment but most of it is portfolio investment coming into the stock market, coming in. It's not so much projects and long-term investment.
Yeah.
So this is investment on arbitrage, on the difference in interest rates, on quick returns, on putting money in and taking it out. But they don't invest depending on how good your domestic policies are or what you think. So if that's the job of, investment in China, you saw how it went up after Tiananmen. So I don't think you need to, that linkage which we draw between domestic behavior of a government, of a regime, and whether the world finds it an attractive investment destination. I think that's a very weak link. What worries them is a lack of law and order, a lack of rule of law, a lack of predictability.
Isn't that
And no, so
apparent?
wait, those are things which start affecting, but first it affects long-term project and other cooperation. It does not so much portfolio investment and the things that happen, you know, that we are actually seeing, which accounts for a lot of the rise that we see in foreign investment now in India.
But the issue of pluralism, you yourself raised it just now, and says when you said that Indian diplomats have had credibility, they've had the credibility of representing a plural democracy, a secular republic where rule of law has been enshrined in the constitution, you know, against discrimination, against crime, etc. Now, you're in a situation where neighboring countries like Pakistan, who have their own issues to deal with and have very little to point fingers about, are sitting there and saying, oh, look, we always told you that, you know, India is anti-Muslim and
no,
see
but
what's
what I'm
happening
saying to
over
you
there.
is that our credibility as Indian diplomats doesn't depend only on this. Primarily, I've seen our credibility go up in my own lifetime when we started growing at more than 6% a year, when we showed the will to test nuclear weapons and become an overt nuclear weapons state in 1998, I saw our credibility rise. I saw how much more seriously other people took us. Those are the primary drivers of your credibility. Your hard power, your economic power, and your ability to function as a state. After that comes the things that you mentioned. But unless you're a credible actor out there and you have the power and the will to actually use that power out in the international system, I mean, then you'd lack credibility. Now, what you're mentioning is a second order problem.
Okay.
And for them, the most important thing is predictability, rule of law, and basically that contracts are kept, that people keep their word, that, you know, what the government promises it does.
So when you say a second order problem, you mean?
First, they look at whether they make money or not before they invest.
And that becomes the driver at
And
events
the higher the
like
risk,
this.
I mean, the higher the return. So, you know, even the most risky places get some investment, but it'll get those who are willing to take huge
that
risks.
risk.
So this becomes part of the cost of business. I'm sorry to be so cynical and to disappoint you, but this is the fact. And I think you should recognize that that's how the world is.
So in today's global scenario, we started off by saying the world has changed. India has had to adapt. Every country has to adapt to new global scenarios. India has changed. The population demographic has changed. We have a young population. We're also in a situation where the entire world is dealing with the United States not having the same kind of clout and power and stature that perhaps it had even a year and a half ago. Are we in a position to claim a bigger role on the global stage as a result of these changes, as a result of perhaps the vacuum that the US is leaving behind? Do you think we can do that?
You know, you are influential globally, have been for several years. Just given your sheer size, your capabilities, what you've built up over 30 years of 6% plus economic growth, what you have in terms of naval and other capabilities. You know, it's just as a market, you matter globally. You have a certain influence. So I'm not sure where you see this suddenly increasing. There might be tactical opportunities which open up because of the disruption that this present US administration causes.
Right.
Because there might be areas that they vacate. There might be areas that also open up because of China's changes, where China starts getting, you know, say, uneconomical in certain sectors because of the way their wages are going up and so on. The aging of their population, for instance. So there will be opportunities, but these are tactical. But I'm not sure what you mean by a role. You have a role already, and you have a fairly big global role already. But for me, the more important thing is that how do you use the external environment, whatever it is,
Right.
in order to transform India? That's your main job.
You said a short while ago that the foreign policy is being used as for a domestic political purposes.
Advantage.
I want to flip that around and ask you, how much do political dispensations impact foreign policy making? Because everyone foreign policy 101 teaches you, no matter who comes and goes, foreign policy is continuity, and you set in motion plans that will find fruition over the course of time. And yet you have leader after leader who wants to come and tweak and put their own personal imprint or claim credit for something, etc. Where are we in that situation? Because the foreign policy that we're seeing, and I think the vote on Jerusalem was a case in point, for example, where there is this proximity with Israel, there's a new strategic partnership, they're calling it, with Israel, and yet when it came to the crunch at the United Nations, India stood firm on voting against this declaration of Jerusalem as the capital. I mean, it weighed its own interests, I suppose. So you have that happening as well. How much of that is political? How much of that is foreign policy? How much of that is individual based?
Well, it seems to me that ultimately foreign policy is about India's interests, right? That doesn't change overnight. But each leader wants to show that he is better, that he has put his stamp on policy, and that is natural. So the presentation, the way it's described, the activity level, those kinds of things will change, depending on the personality of the leader and what they actually want to, what they think is important. But the Jerusalem vote is a good example, because if you look at it, we've managed the impossible. For several years, we have maintained good relations with Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all at the same time. The big four regional powers in the Middle East. I don't think there is any other country which can claim that of having maintained good relations with all four, even though their internal relationships were fraught between them, certainly between Saudi Iran, Israel, and so on. Despite that, we've managed this for several years, consistently. And that's because of India's interests. We have interests in each of these, and we have followed them separately, and we've stayed out of their internal fights or their internal politics. As long as we can continue to do that, I think that's what works in India's interest. And that's what we need to do going forward. Now, we've developed a relationship with Israel steadily since we opened the embassy in '92.
Right.
And we've actually steadily worked at that relationship, and it's grown to the point where it's very important to us in many ways. So, and that's a good thing, but so has our relationship grown with other big regional powers in the Middle East, in West Asia. So for me, this is a good example of where India's interests prevail, and as long as they prevail, I think you do well.
So if you we're at the start of 2018, if you were to list 5 priority areas for Indian foreign policy this year, what would they be? The
neighborhood, the immediate neighborhood, South Asia.
Has it been neglected according to you?
I don't think it's been neglected so much as it's got more complicated and more difficult, many of these relationships. And you have very difficult issues here, like the Rohingyas, and these are issues you need to address. I think the neighborhood is number one. Secondly, you need a much more active economic diplomacy. I mean, you're watching the economic landscape change terribly around you. RCP is now the regional cooperation economic partnership in Southeast Asia, basically, Far East and Southeast Asia. That is the only game in town today. The multilateral trading system is under all kinds of stress. Protectionism is growing. And yet, as I said, almost half your GDP depends on external trade. So, you'd better go out there and either shape the environment or work with those who share your interests. Because otherwise, it's going to affect your future and your ability to grow at 7+%, which you say you must do because you need to create the jobs and so on at home. So that's number 2. Number 3 is, I think you need to also rebalance with some of the major powers. With China, with Russia, with the US, you need to look at the balance that you maintain in those relationships. There are stresses there that you need to worry about. But most important, you need to build capabilities at home, because you're in a much more uncertain world, and that's really the biggest. You need to improve the levers and the instruments of power that you have in India. That's going to take serious work.
And how would you do that?
Oh, well, whichever you look at, you start with the foreign policy apparatus. I think it's far too small. It's very capable, and so far it's been very relatively successful compared to any other foreign office in the world. I think we can hold our heads up. But that doesn't mean that we can cope with all the demands that are going to be placed on us. That's already straining at the seams. But that's true of every which way, wherever you look.
But there's a criticism that foreign policy has become highly centralized right now. I mean,
who makes the decision? That's not my problem here. The question is, do you have the bandwidth? Do you have the people? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the ability, the system to actually deal with whatever comes? I think that's the important. But that's not only foreign policy. This is true of security. This is true of a whole range of issues. And certainly on economic policy making, for instance, external economic policy making. It's scattered within government, the responsibility. So it's dealt with in ad hoc fashion.
What do you say to also a little bit of transparency? Because, I mean, you take Doklam, for example. There's been, while they may be very careful, there's been conflicting reports from China and from India on what happened, what's going on.
There's a lot of mythology going around. No, frankly,
but
foreign policy by its nature,
know?
It's a democracy. You need to let people know, yes. But you don't solve Doklam in public. By its nature, diplomacy is a private art. Because that's where you can actually sit and talk things through and do the give and take. That doesn't mean that you don't operate, because as any good leader will tell you, a leader is not only led by public opinion, but also leads it, but helps to create it. But the substance of it, just by making everything known, actually doesn't make it easier to solve.
But that's also on a case-by-case basis, because you would employ different tactics perhaps if it came to Pakistan.
I'm not sure. It depends on whether you want to solve issues or not. Very often I find leaks and so on are calculated when you don't want to solve the issue. You don't want the responsibility. But that's true in all capitals. You show me a capital where people don't leak, where they don't try and manipulate or spin the media. I mean, I don't think such a capital exists.
Possibly not, not. But I think the larger issue is, or to me, certainly as a journalist, I'm on the other side of the fence, I make no bones about it, I want to know what's going on. There seems to be a very...
No, I agree. It's a democracy. You have to carry people with you, and you have to explain to people why you're doing it.
But what comes across, and maybe I'm wrong and you can correct me, what comes across is there is, for all its caution and for all its practicality of private diplomacy, there seems to be a fear of China. And that's what's driving the caution.
There's no reason for it. There's no reason whatsoever for it. You are today better placed than you ever have been before. Even in terms of the simple metrics of power. You have capabilities today that you didn't have 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, I don't know why, if you say there's fear, I don't sense fear anyway. And look, after, all these years of a successful experience of managing a very difficult and complicated relationship, why do we think we can't do it in the future? I don't think we should underestimate ourselves.
Shivshankar Menon, thank you so much for speaking to Wide Angle. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.